Well, good morning. It's a beautiful day here in Edwardsville, Illinois. It's Sunday morning. The sun is shining. Feeling a little bit of hope today. I know all of us are just stressed over different ways that we're having to handle this crisis in our life. But I know for me, and I pray for you, that you will know the hope that only comes through God. And I talking to a friend last night, and she's worried and concerned, and my response is that we can be worried, we can be concerned for just a little bit, but then we've got to push on and pass on to our own faith, the faith that we have in God, that we know God's going to see us through this thing one way or another. So I'm really glad that you're joining with me this morning, and you're joining with us on this group. Let's go for a walk. And my purpose again behind this is knowing that we're shut in, we're locked in. But these are the moments that we can spend time with God, that we can grow in our faith, and we can grow in some of our knowledge of the scripture, which feeds into our faith. So that's my hope and my prayer to be able to do for you and to help you. And as I'd said earlier, those of you that know me, I'm currently going through writing this curriculum for my own small group here at our own church. And as I'm walking through this, I can't even explain the things that God is teaching me through the Old Testament, stories that I've already known. But they're coming to life and just different aspects of these stories that I never realized. One of my heartbeats for my group, and they know that they're young moms, working moms, overloaded with life. But one of my goals for them was to learn more scripture, so that when their kids come home from church or Sunday school or whatever they're a part of, that they'll be able to understand a little bit more of those stories that we tend to tell at church from the Old Testament. Stories of Noah and Moses and creation and all of those things. So hopefully this will help you, maybe in this aspect, but maybe it'll come out from a different angle for you. One of the things that I enjoy doing is I enjoy telling stories. I teach a class at church on our spiritual gifts, and one of the things that I've learned for me is my number one gift is teaching, hands down. But I also know that in that teaching, there's a creative element that kind of comes out in me that I think I've had for a long time, but now I'm allowing it to kind of blossom in my own life. So bear with me, because I'm going to tell you some stories from the Old Testament. We're going to walk through a lot of those things, but I'm also going to tell you stories that I have written in lieu of these scriptures. So the first lesson we're going to start with today actually starts in the New Testament, which is kind of an odd place for us to start when we're going to talk about the Old Testament. But I believe that there's such a connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I've heard a lot of people say, I don't understand the Old Testament, and so I don't read it very often. So my prayer and my hope is that we'll be able to walk through some of that. So let's start in the book of Hebrews chapter 11. Some of you have heard of that. Some of you have not. So I'm going to try to give a little bit of a balance there, not to assume that you know things, but not overbear you with things that you probably already know. So hopefully we'll get a little bit of a balance. So today's lesson is called Walking Through the Old Testament, and it's a walk of faith. So again, we're going to start in the book of Hebrews, but I'm going to read you some of the things that I have written. We often think that there is a minimal connection between the Old and the New Testament. The Old Testament is a great book of history with amazing battles between opposing people. The pattern of the people in the Old Testament is to go to war with people they don't like, kill as many as they can, plunder all of their wares, live high on the hog until somebody does it to them. Rinse, wash, repeat. But also intermixed in these moments of battle are these amazing stories that we get to read to our children as we tuck them in bed. Noah and the ark, Jonah and the whale, Moses and the Red Sea. Amazing stories that make for some great bedtime reading. So why read the New Testament to start a study in the Old Testament? Because in Hebrews chapter 11, the writer of Hebrews brings these these big Old Testament stories full circle. This chapter is often titled the Hall of Faith. I don't know if you've ever heard anybody allude to it, but that's what it's called. It's called the Hall of Faith. It listing many of the big players of the Old Testament, but it gives us so much more than their successful resume. It provides an amazing tie between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So let's read some of these scriptures together. If you have your Bible with you, go ahead and open it. If you got the Bible app, go ahead and open that to Hebrews chapter 11. And we're going to walk through some of these things. I'm going to read this to you because I feel like God's scripture is so important within context. So I will be giving you context in a lot of things that we study in this. So let's read together Hebrews chapter 11, and then we're going to move on into chapter 12, just the first few verses. So read with me. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith Abel still speaks even though he is dead. By faith Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about the things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place that he later received as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who are heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so, from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. All these people were living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. Let's read that one again. Verse 13. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country that they had left, they would have an opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned with God. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. So in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw that he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who was invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the application of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith, the people passed through the Red Sea on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. By faith, the prostitute, Rahab, because she reckoned the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it. About David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released, so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, that only together with us they may be made perfect. Chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders the sin that so easily entangles us, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who has endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. These are our incredible scriptures to start with the study of the Old Testament. But as I went back and I looked at Hebrews chapter 11, which I've read this so many times in my life, there was something that stood out to me that I had never, ever grasped in my life. So I'm going to walk through some of these things with you, and hopefully you'll get your own understanding. Maybe God will speak to you today of something you need today in your life. So let's move on. As you walk down the hall of faith, look at the portraits hanging on the walls. These corridors are long and filled with many recognizable greats and many not so recognizable greats. Some we recognize and some that we have never heard of. So why are they great? What makes them great? What distinguishes the great from the not so great? There is one word that is the dividing factor, just one word that can change your life from mediocre to great. One word that can take you from the dusty old streets to hanging your portrait on the wall in the hall. What's that word? Think of that. Process through your mind. So now we're going to go back and we're going to read together chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. I'm going to reread these to you. And hopefully this will answer this question for you. Chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command. Why did the writer of Hebrews make this statement? Go back and take a look at it. Now faith is the confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Why did he make that statement? Think of that, about that in your own mind. Process that in your own mind. So what does it mean when it says faith shows the reality of what we hope for? Think about that. How can faith, follow with me, how can faith, which is something intangible, we can't touch faith. I can't see faith. So it's something that's intangible. How can it become something that's tangible? Something that's real? How does it become evidence? How can the intangible become the tangible? It's kind of like the wind. We can't see the wind. You guys have heard this illustration so many times, but you can't see the wind. I can't see it, but I can feel it. And I can watch the trees blow outside. So what I'm doing is I'm seeing something that is intangible, which is faith, like the wind. But I'm seeing the result of something in a very tangible way. With the wind, I see it blowing. I see the trees blow. I feel it on my skin. So the same thing is with our faith. Faith is something that's intangible. But how does that become something that's tangible, something that we can touch? So listen to this. Faithfulness is active obedience. Our intangible faith becomes tangible because when we are faithful, when I am faithful to God, I'm obedient. So my faith that is intangible just became something very tangible in my obedience. We are obedient to God's desires when we are obedient to God's desires, and when we are obedient to God's desires, other people see our obedience. Therefore, our faith becomes real and seen and tangible. So here's a couple of questions for you to ask yourself. What is one way your faithfulness has become active obedience? Think about that in your life right now. What is one way, maybe with your kids, maybe with your husband, maybe with your families, your coworkers, what is one way that your faith has become tangible, has become something that they can see? And then where has your faith moved from intangible to tangible? I remember a story when my youngest was getting ready to, I was trying to decide what college he wanted to go to. And his biggest desire in life was to go to the University of Oklahoma. Yeah, great idea. Sounds like a good goal. No way that we could afford that. And I remember I just kept pushing and saying, Mom, I believe that I'm going to go. I'm supposed to go to the University of Oklahoma. Okay, cool. So, like a good mom, I listened to him, but knowing in my mind, there's no way that we could afford to do that. So we began looking at other options, and I began pushing towards other options. There was a moment I will never forget. He was leaving for school that morning for high school, as a senior in high school. And he stopped me in the hall, and he looked at me, and he said, Mom, I believe that this is where God wants me to go. I will never forget that conversation of my son. At that point, my youngest son's faith was bigger than my faith. And that comment from him drove me to my knees, literally to my knees in my bedroom that day. And I began to pray. God, I only want my child to go where you want him to go. And if this is where you want him to go, make it real. Won't finish the story, but bottom line, my son graduated last May from the University of Oklahoma, a degree in Arabic, and now he's a lieutenant in the Army. But the specifics of that story, of that faith of my child, how he pushed me from my faith to become active obedience. So what is that line for you? Where does your faith, your intangible faith, become tangible? Think about that. All right, so we're going to go back to the scriptures and we're going to talk about the Hall of Faith. So one of the things that I do with my small group is we kind of just start out and I say, tell me what you know. Just tell me what you know. Knowing that I tell them don't think too hard. We just want a baseline of knowledge. So I'm going to do that same to you, a little different on a video, but I want to ask you for you to tell me what you know. So we're going to go down this list, and obviously you're not going to be able to speak back to me, but think about these things. So tell me what you know. Tell me what you know about the creation of the universe. Tell me what you know about Abel. Tell me what you know about Enoch. I know your mind's processing if you know anything about these people. Tell me what you know about Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Joseph, Moses, walls of Jericho, Rahab, Gideon, Barak, all of those other names. Tell me what you know. All right, so a lot of times in studying the scriptures, sometimes we just need a baseline of knowledge in order to build from that to hear the story. And please hear me, knowing the Bible and studying the Bible has nothing to do with knowledge, but it has everything to do with the application of God's greatness. So please hear me in that. All right, so we're going to take a look at Hebrews chapter 11, and we're going to read through verse 39, and then we're going to switch over to chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. So verse 39 says, these were all, the people they're talking about, is all of the ones that the writer of Hebrews just addressed. Abraham, Noah, Moses, Rahab. So that's these. These are all the greats from the Old Testament. So these were all commended for their faith. And this is incredible. Yet none of them received what God had promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us they would be made perfect. I read that, and I went back and I reread it, and I reread it, and I reread it, and it's like, what is it trying to say here? There's something deeper than what I get when I typically just skim the scriptures. So this is what I came up with. The past has been filled with great icons and heroes of the faith. The Old Testament is filled with story after story of great faithfulness, active obedience. When we look to the past of the heroes of faith, we often feel as though we can't measure up or that we have missed out. They witnessed God in ways that we will never experience. The parting of the Red Sea, hanging out in a large boat for 40 days while surviving the great flood, slaying the giants with a simple stone. But scriptures say that they were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. That statement shocked and confused me. Why would it say that? When I looked at these stories, at these lives, I think that they had received what they had promised. If they didn't receive the promise, then all their efforts seem futile and needless. Then it makes me think that my own efforts to be faithful are futile and done in vain. And I thought, that stinks. When I looked more closely at the statement, at the end of that statement, things did not seem quite as futile. There were two words that moved for me the feeling of hopelessness into feelings of hope. And those two words are with us. With us, they, the greats, would be made perfect. Who are they? They are the greats of the Old Testament. Who is the us? Well, it's us. It's you. It's me. They needed me in order to be made perfect. That's a crazy and mind-blowing thought. Noah needs me to complete his promise. Abraham needs me to complete his promise. Sarah needs me to complete her promise. The believers from the Old Testament need the present day believers to complete the promise, to complete the picture, to complete the story. We often look at the end of our stories with great dissatisfaction, wondering if the stories have a purpose. We often ask, why did the story end here? There must be more. The believers of the Old Testament also may have looked for more. They may have wondered why the story stopped. They may have looked to reconcile the story with the promise. When Noah reached the end of his ark journey, did he see the fulfillment of his promise? He experienced God's safe protection of his family and himself through the worst flood in the history of mankind. Check out the rainbow. But did he really see the fulfillment of God's promise? His life continued with heartache and destruction. Heartache and destruction do not feel like a fulfillment of a promise to me. It feels like the total opposite. So what was the missing link? What was it going to take to complete this promise? The reconciliation of the story with the promise is us, the present believer. When the author of Hebrews spoke to the present believer, he said, only together with us would they, the greats of old, be made perfect. The story was not over. The story is not over. We are not left out of the story. We are the current story. So think of it as the Olympic torch. Over the years, the significance of the torch has evolved to our present day enactment of this ancient tradition. The flame is the symbol to represent the connection between the ancient games and the modern games. Before the opening of the Olympic Games, a torch is lit months prior in Olympia, Greece. That torch is then passed from person to person, town to town, country to country, until it reaches its destination to light the cauldron at the current Olympic Stadium. When that torch is originally lit, there was no way that runner can run that torch all the way from Greece to the Olympic game destination. That torch must be passed on to the next runner, swimmer, skier, and so forth. The first torch runner needs that final torch runner to complete the task or the purpose or the promise. But interestingly, every torch runner in between is just as significant as the first and final runner. Not one person would argue with that significance. Now look at this in lieu of these verses in Hebrews. Back in the days of old, the days of the Old Testament, that torch was lit. Noah, Moses, Abraham, and so many others lit that torch and began running. As they ran, they passed that torch to another, and then another, until that torch reached us. They knew when they first lit that torch that they would never see the final lighting. But because of their faith, they continued to pass the torch, knowing that the next person would grab it and run with it. We are standing on that roadway, and as we are standing there, we see the torch coming. It is a faint light glowing from afar, but as it gets closer and closer, the light gets brighter and brighter. As it approaches even closer, we begin to feel the warmth of the fire. We see that the runner before us looks exhausted as he carries the torch. But we also see a face of determination and pleasure as he has been blessed to be chosen to carry the torch. Then when we touch the stem of the torch, there is an emotion of elation flowing through us, yet an emotion of fear questioning whether we can complete the leg of this run. As we take our first step, we feel a little more confident. With each subsequent step, we soon realize that we are not doing this on our own strength. There is a goal, a mission, a purpose, a promise that drives us to completion of our task. As we continue down our road, we begin to get tired. As we round the curve in the road, we see someone standing in the middle of the road. We know that it's time to pass on this torch. Our legs grow weary, and it's time to let go. But then hand it to the next person who is full of energy and ready to run. We too never see the actual lighting of the cauldron with our own eyes, but we know that it will be lit. Why do we know? Because of our faith. What if you were to carry the torch of Noah or Moses or Rahab? Have you ever thought of the importance you have in this story, the importance of you grabbing that torch? You may be using the excuse of exhaustion or inadequacy or to not complete your leg of this course. What if Noah had used that excuse? If he had, mankind would no longer be in existence, but his strength did not come from himself. Where does your strength come from? It comes from the God of grace. Same God, same strength. They need us to complete this course, this promise. As we stand with the greats of old surrounding us, watching us, cheering us on, we need to continue to press on for the promise. The greats of old are depending on us for this completion. In Hebrews chapter 12:1, it says, "Let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up." So throw everything aside and press on, march on, persevere on. Our goal, our lighting of the cauldron, is the promise giver, Jesus himself. In that final leg of the race, that torch will be handed over to Jesus. We stand and watch as he lights the cauldron, completes the promise. Fix our eyes on him. Jesus was and is the completion of the promise. He endured the cross, scorned its shame, and sat down at the right hand of God. Promise fulfilled? Check. Hopefully you could take these things and you can begin to think about your own heart, your own life, where you currently are. I know we're in a mess right now. But what are you going to do as that torch has been handed to you? What are you doing right now? What am I doing right now to keep running that race, to pass it on to the next people, our children? Think of that. Don't drop that torch. Pass it on, because someday we're all going to see that ultimate fulfillment of the promise of Jesus. Thanks for listening. I hope and I pray this touches your heart like it touches mine.